Every day around the world, 1.5 billion people, or pretty close to that, are greeted when they log on to Facebook with the following question: what's on your mind? And when they first get on, there are a lot of things that could be on their mind. This past weekend, what was on everybody's mind was the 4th of July, the fireworks that they were looking at, the food that they were enjoying, the family and friends that they were around, maybe just being able to take a break. Yesterday, what was on the mind of a lot of my friends, and myself included, unfortunately, is what's going to happen to our basketball team here. That's not something I wanted on my mind. Sometimes it's vacations you're going on. Sometimes it's something you've read or some joke that you've heard, and that's what's on your mind, and you want to share that with other people. Sometimes it's pictures of cats, if some of you are still doing that. There are a lot of things that could be on our mind, and when we first get on, are there on our mind. But as people scroll through their news feeds on Facebook and other places, what's on their mind begins to change. You go through and you see the car that a friend of yours got and wonder, why am I still driving the old car that I've got? You see pictures of this family who's posted something fun that they have done, and you go, every time I see a picture of their house, even though they have the same number of kids as me, their house is always perfectly clean. Why isn't mine that way? Or you look and see, are they really on their 3rd vacation? I haven't even taken one this year. The term for this is called the fear of missing out. And ironically, the thing that is supposed to give us connection to the world, that was created for us to become more social and interact with more people, is making us more disconnected and more detached from everybody else around us. Today begins the first in a 4-part series that we're calling Social Needia. And why we go to these places online, what we're really looking for. Now, before you tune out and say, okay, I don't use any of these online places, you don't have to understand what we're talking about. The online things we're dealing with are simply catch-all illustrations that could be replaced by any number of things in your life. These just serve as great illustrations that we use to fulfill a need in our life, and that they ultimately cannot provide for us. It's coming out that more and more people are, as a result of social media, becoming not connected, but depressed, anxious, that they're worried about all the things that they're not doing in their life, and why everybody else is getting to do everything that they wish they could be doing. What I want us to talk about this morning is this question. I want us to answer the question, do you like me? Now, if you're familiar with Facebook, that's been the thing from day one. Liking what somebody has to say or liking what somebody's posted. And we use places like Facebook because we want to be liked. We want to belong to something. We want to belong to a group of people. We want to belong to something that gives us purpose. And ultimately, things like Facebook, things like our jobs, things like the pursuit of money, things like people, our friends, they cannot provide for us the need to belong that we have. This morning I want us to talk about a woman that wanted to belong and how Jesus helped her find out how she could truly belong to something. This is the woman at the well in Samaria in John chapter 4. If you have your Bible, turn over there. In this chapter, we're going to encounter a woman who's trying to find belonging in her life and is finding out that the places she's looking can't provide what she's looking for. And then only Jesus can deliver that for her. As we go through this and see how Jesus provides that belonging for this woman, I want you to think about this question. Where are you looking for belonging? I mentioned a few of these places just a moment ago. You could look for belonging in your finances. If I make enough money, I will have finally arrived. Or you might look for belonging in some kind of club or group and say, if I'm a part of this, then I can say I truly belong to something. Maybe you're looking at belonging in the people that are around your life, but here's the thing, they're all going to let you down or not fulfill what you're looking for. There's only one person, there's only one thing that can, and that's Jesus. And as we look that and look that over and prove that, I want you to think, where am I looking for belonging in my life? When you talk about the woman at the well, I want us to start here in verse 5 of chapter 4. Here's what we're going to see. That Jesus cared for this woman. In helping her find belonging, Jesus cares for this woman. Starting in verse 5 of John chapter 4. So he came to a town of Samaria called Sychar, near the field that Jacob had given to his son Joseph. Jacob's well was there. So Jesus, wearied as he was from his journey, was sitting beside the well. It was about the 6th hour. A woman from Samaria came to draw water. Jesus said to her, "Give me a drink," for his disciples had gone away into the city to buy food. The Samaritan woman said to him, "How is it that you, a Jew, ask for a drink from me, a woman of Samaria? For Jews have no dealings with Samaritans." There are a couple of phrases I want us to notice here out of John chapter 4 that show just how much Jesus cared about this woman. The first is this. There in verse 6, it says that Jesus, wearied as he was from his journey. I like this verse because it's one of those glimpses into, yes, Jesus was human while he was here on earth, and he struggled with the things we struggle with. He's tired. Jesus is exhausted, and for good reason. He's been traveling, and they've been traveling on foot, and he's with his disciples, but it's not just travel. While he's traveling, we have in some places in the Gospels the disciples having arguments. So Jesus has got to deal with arguments, like he's walking around with 12 children behind him, fighting about various things. And so he's got to stop and talk to them about those things. And then along with that, when he's not walking, then he's somewhere where he's either teaching for long periods of time, or people are asking him to do this miracle, heal this person, help this person walk, feed us, take care of us. He's constantly doing. And so he's tired. You add to this in verses 1 through 4 of this, it appears that Samaria wasn't really on the travel itinerary. It wasn't part of the plan. If you go back up there to verse 1, when Jesus learned that the Pharisees had heard that Jesus was making and baptizing more disciples than John, although Jesus himself did not baptize, but only his disciples, he left Judea and departed again for Galilee, and he had to pass through Samaria. Now, it may have been that Samaria was part of the travel plan, but it may also be that because of this information that he's aware of now, he's got to take a little trip up through Samaria. And so now the trip is a little longer than they planned, and here Jesus is wearied. I've used this excuse before, where I'll come home and my son will say, "Dad, let's wrestle." I get it now, having done that to my dad growing up. "Hey, Dad, you're home, let's do something." And I have given this response on more than one occasion. Daddy's too tired right now. Let me rest just a second. We'll do that here in just a little while, but let me have a break. I've got the excuse. I'm tired. I woke up early, which is my kid's fault, by the way, so if he wants to wrestle, let me sleep. But I woke up early. I've worked all day. I'm wearied. I'm tired, and I have an excuse to say, "Not right now. Let me rest, and when I'm a little more well-rested, or at least have a little more energy, then we can go do this." Jesus has a great excuse here to not have to engage in conversation. He strikes up the conversation in verse 8. He starts it. He doesn't have to do that. She'll probably just get her water, go back to town. It'll all be over with. He's too tired anyway. He doesn't have to have a conversation here. But he doesn't allow this to be an excuse. Because he doesn't think about how wearied and tired he is. He sees a woman who's going to go spend eternity somewhere. He sees a woman who feels a lack of belonging in her life. And he's got the answer. And so he provides this answer for her and cares for her and ignores his own weariness and engages her in conversation. Here's the second, there in verse 9. How is it that you, a Jew, ask for a drink from me, a woman of Samaria? For the Jews had no dealings with Samaritans. There are two parts to this here in verse 9. She lays out a couple different specifications of what's going on here. She says, first, how is it that you ask me, a woman of Samaria? This was not a typical interaction that would happen. Men and women typically did not interact in this sort of way, and so it's weird that Jesus is ignoring that, because everybody else would have just ignored her. That's the way of things at that time. But Jesus ignores that and stops to speak to her. That's weird thing number one. Weird thing number two, how is it that you, a Jew, ask for a drink from me, a woman of Samaria? And John provides a little more to that. For the Jews had no dealings with Samaritans. The Samaritans were just north of the area of Judea, and just north up there in Jerusalem, and they were Jewish people that had married into the nations around them. And with Israel's history into idol worship all throughout the Old Testament, there's a little bit of apprehension there. We don't want to interact with these people who have married with the people in the land that may not serve God. The Samaritans have taken what God had said to do in worship and twisted that a little bit. Later on in this chapter, the woman says, the Samaritans worship over on this mountain, the Jews worship over on this one. One of those is where God said to worship, the other one's not. The Samaritans and the Jews did not have good relationships. They didn't interact with one another. They didn't like each other. And so now there's a racial tension that exists here, and Jesus doesn't care about that either. What he cares about is the person that he's talking to. He knows that she needs to belong, that she's looking for it. And so, in spite of his weariness, and even though there are plenty of reasons why he doesn't have to, or he shouldn't in that culture talk to this Samaritan woman, he says, I don't care about that, I care about her. That's the first thing he does. Here's the second. Jesus engages with this woman. We're not going to read verses 7 through 26, but within that section, 9 different times, and when I say engages, we're going to look at 2 parts to this. The first is this. We're going to see Jesus speak. But it's not what he does in Matthew chapter 5 through 7. It's not several chapters of a big long sermon. It's not some big long lesson, though he is going to teach something here, but it's not just Jesus unloading all of this information. 9 different times it says that Jesus said to her. They're having a back and forth. I've gotten in this bad habit. I did it this morning, and I noticed it as soon as I did it. And I know why I did it. Still a bad habit. And I've done this to several of you here. I don't know that you've ever done it to me, so this isn't meant to be some confessional period for me, but I'm aware of this. So if you've ever heard me do this, I know that I'm doing it, trying to work on it. Somebody will ask me, Jack, how are you doing? And I'll say, I'm good, period. And I stop right there. What should I follow that up with? How are you? What have I done when I don't ask something back? I have killed the conversation. I'm good, and then I keep going. I know why I'm doing it, but it's not a good thing that I'm doing. I'm killing the conversation. Jesus doesn't let the conversation die. He starts the conversation, but then he keeps the ball rolling. 9 times, Jesus said to her. He keeps the conversation going back and forth because he cares about her. And he cares about how she feels. She needs to belong, and he has the answer for it. And so he's going to keep this conversation going so he can help get her there. That's not all he does. The second is that he engaged with her by listening to what she had to say. If you go through, starting in verse 7, you read through this whole narrative down through verse 26, you see Jesus' replies have to do with what the woman says to him. Bob Turner, who's visited a couple times this year, and he'll be back again here very shortly. One of the things that he mentioned in class one time when I was with him is that we've kind of lost the ability, or we've stopped listening to people and what they have to say. What we're really doing a lot of the time is just waiting for our turn to say something. So if somebody starts talking about an experience they've had, our mind goes to, oh, I've had a similar experience. When they're done talking about theirs, then I'll talk about mine. And it's connected, sure, but we're not asking about their experience. We're not talking to them about what they just said. We're just piling on stories because we want to talk. We want to share our side of things. We're not really listening and hearing what people have to say. We're just waiting until it's our turn to respond. Jesus doesn't do that here either. He hears what she has to say, and then he follows it up with, well, that's interesting. Here's a question. Or have you ever thought about this in connection with what you're saying? If you go look, it's a very clear back and forth. They start talking about water. That conversation about water turns into this conversation about her home life. This conversation about her home life turns into this discussion on worship. And then it ultimately concludes with she realizes who she's talking to. He's not just a guy who doesn't care about the boundaries. He's not just a prophet. He is the Son of God. And that causes her to go do something we'll talk about in a moment. But in helping her to belong and to find belonging, Jesus makes it clear to her that he cares about her and where she ends up. And he engages her in conversation, a back and forth. Not a lecture, not a here's what you need to know. He hears what she has to say. He wants to know where she's coming from and engages her in a back and forth. Here's the third thing he did. Jesus focused this conversation to a point. In verse 10, we read this. In talking about the water, he says, Jesus answered her, if you knew the gift of God and who it is that is saying to you, give me a drink, you would have asked him and he would have given you living water. What's his point in bringing that up? Well, he's trying to focus the conversation to God. He knows to some degree this Samaritan woman is religious, and while not everything there is correct, he's trying to get her in this conversation to focus on God because he knows she needs to belong, and that that's only going to happen if she realizes her standing with God. She needs to be with God. That's where true belonging is. And so in verse 10, if you knew the gift of God. And then when you go down to verse 23, when they're talking about worship, chapter 2, right, is water into wine. Chapter 4 is water into worship. He takes a discussion about a well and turns it into a discussion about worship. I don't know if you've ever tried to do something like that before. It's not an easy thing to do at all. But he does it seamlessly here. And in verse 23, but the hour is coming and is now here when the true worshipers will worship in spirit, worship the Father in spirit and truth. For the Father is seeking such people to worship him. He's telling her, listen, you're talking about worshiping on this mountain and the Jews worship over on this mountain. Soon, that's not going to matter whatsoever. The Father is looking for these true worshipers. You could be one of those true worshipers. The Father is looking for people like that. She's looking to belong, and the Father is looking for somebody like her. You're going to be looking for these true worshipers. So if you start becoming this true worshiper, you're not going to have to worry about belonging because the Father's going to find you. After she hears all of this, realizes this is the Christ, the Son of God, she goes back into her city. The disciples come back out to Jesus. They went in to go get food. I feel like of all the things that the disciples did, I probably would have been really good at that part. Hey, Jesus, we need to go get food. What are we going to eat right now? Probably would have been really good at that. Well, they come back and they have food, and Jesus says, I've got food you don't know about, which is very confusing to them. They have no idea what's going on, but here's what he says in verse 34. My food is to do the will of him who sent me and to accomplish his work. Jesus always focused the conversation to God. He always focused the conversation to the Father. This wasn't just something he was doing because he thought, well, I'm going to try it this time and see if it works for this woman here. That's what he always did, because that's what it always comes down to. And in the case of this woman who's looking for a place to belong, he's got the very place that she needs, the only place that can truly be fulfilled. It's in the Lord. I want you to notice this before we press on here to the end. Where is this woman trying to find fulfillment? There are a couple indicators we're given in this text. The first one is this, down there in verse 16. Jesus said to her, "Go, call your husband and come here." The woman answers, "I have no husband." And Jesus says, "You're right to say that. You've had 5, and now you're with a 6th man who is not even your husband." Now, she doesn't really have the ability to divorce, so these husbands have either died or they've divorced her in that culture. But she is with this 6th man, not her husband. She appears to be trying to find fulfillment in people. And I add to that this point that's made there in verse 6. Jacob's well was there. So Jesus, wearied as he was from his journey, was sitting beside the well. It was about the 6th hour. You probably have a footnote that says, here's when the 6th hour was. It's about noon. Do you think it's a good idea to go do the work of drawing water from a very deep well, as she says later that the well is very deep? You think it makes sense to go in the middle of the day, the hottest point of the day, to go do that? It doesn't. In fact, most of the time the women would go at dawn or dusk because it's much cooler to do that work. And so why is she here in the middle of the day? It appears she's here because she and the other women of the town may not really get along all that well. She doesn't belong to their group. She's with this 6th man trying to find a place of belonging. She can't find belonging with the women of the town. She's looking for it somewhere, in people, and people are letting her down. I think it's perfectly reasonable to say, to assume that not all of the previous husbands died, but that some of those husbands said, okay, I'm done with you. And so she's tried to find belonging with people, and it's failing every time. She can't find it. Jesus knows all of this. And so he addresses her by showing how much he cares. He engages with her in conversation. He directs that conversation. He focuses that conversation on God. And as a result, verse 28, why is the woman there? Why are you at the well? She needs to get water. But after this big, long conversation with Christ where he shows her, here's how you can find true belonging, the text says she left her water jar. She leaves it. I don't know if she's filled it with water or if she's even yet to do that. She found something mined and goes immediately back to the city. She found something much better than the water she was going to get in the first place. You need water, but for right now it can wait because I found belonging. You know what happens when she goes back to the town? She says to the people in the town, "Come see a man who told me everything I've ever done. Could this man be the Son of God?" And the city goes out. They go out to meet Jesus. This is around verse 29. They go out to meet him. They go out to talk to him and hear from him his own words. Here Jesus is wearied, and what's he doing? He's talking again. But he sees people who need to belong. We skipped over this just a second ago, but in verse 34, when Jesus says, "My food's to do the will of him who sent me and to accomplish his work," here's what he says to the disciples following that. He says, "Harvest isn't for a few months. That's when everything will be ready, everything will be grown, everything will be ready for harvest. But the food that I care about," Jesus is saying, just look up right now. Look over to the city of Sychar over here in Samaria. They're ready. These people are looking for belonging. These people are ready to commit to that thing that will finally provide what it is they're looking for. He tells the disciples, look up, that's why we're here. This is the purpose. These people need to belong. And we've got what they need for them to get there. And that's why he stops and talks to this woman. Because he knows where she is, what she's looking for, and he knows the way to find it. Where are you looking for belonging? If you're looking for belonging in finances, this came up in the older kids class on Wednesday night. In talking about kind of the angel on your shoulder, the devil on your other thing. There's this bad thing that I know I shouldn't do, and this is what God wants me to do. And in asking that question, the student said, okay, let's say this temptation is to rob a bank, and I could get $1 million, no problem, but I know God doesn't want me to rob the bank. I said, it's more than that. What's $1 million? Because we had just been talking about eternity. I said, you get to take that with you. When's the money run out? Or it runs out when you spend it all, or it runs out when you're not around to spend it anymore. It doesn't go with you. So it's more than just God doesn't want you to do this. It's God has something greater that will last forever. $1 million doesn't matter. Same thing is true with trying to find belonging in our finances. You could have the nicest house in the world. It doesn't go with you. Don't try to find your belonging in stuff, because it doesn't stick around. People, even your best friends. And I think about my best friends. They've let me down a time or two, and I've let them down a time or two. People are going to fail you. And they may not mean to. It may be an accident, but it's going to happen. Your job, if you place all your value, all your belonging in your job, what happens when you can't do the job anymore? When you can't do the job like you used to? It's going to fail you. The only one that can fulfill our need to belong is Jesus. In the Lord's Supper talk, David, just a moment ago, talked about heroes. How you grow up and these heroes that you idolize, you realize, okay, they're not real. Superman's not around. And the movies might be fun, or the TV shows might be fun, but at some point you realize, okay, they're not there, but Jesus is always there. Jesus is always capable. Jesus still cares. The same Jesus who was weary here and spoke anyway was the Jesus that was weary as he carried the cross to his death. But he did it because he cared. Because he wants us to be able to belong. And he knew that if he didn't do it, we would not be able to fulfill our need to belong to something greater than ourselves. Because of what he did, we can belong to God's family. Not just here, but all over the world. If you're here this morning and you're not a Christian, we want to help you find out how you can become a part of this family to belong. Not just to this family here, but to the Christians all over the world. God's family. To the Christians, I want to say this. A lot of you, and let's do a show of hands with this. How many of you have family within 30 minutes of where you live? And I'm not talking about the family that lives in your house, obviously. But put those hands back up. Everybody look around at the hands. My daughter's raising her hand. She doesn't understand the question, so ignore that one. That's a lot of hands. That's just about everybody. Sometimes, because we have physical family so close, we can cling to them or reach out to them and go, well, I'm going to spend time with this family, and I'm not saying don't spend time with your family. That's not what I'm saying at all. There are a few hands, though. There are a few people in here with just their family, and their closest family is hours away or another state over. They're not that close to their physical family. And this is the family they have. And if it's not for this family, then they just have to either interact with themselves or themselves, and that's it. And it can be easy sometimes to know that, all right, I've got physical family close, I'm going to do things with them, and forget about this family here. Jesus died for this family here, so that anybody, no matter the background, the Samaritan woman, the person today in 2019, can find belonging in a spiritual home greater than anything else that exists. So to the Christian here, I want to encourage you to do this. Think about the people here in your spiritual family. Try to, this week, remind them, whoever it is, of our belonging together. If you want to have people in your home, have somebody in your home, just to remind ourselves that we belong to the same family. Take somebody out, because we belong to the same family. Message somebody, call somebody, write a letter to somebody in this church, because we belong to the same family, because Christ died for us so that we could belong to something greater than ourselves. I'm thankful for this family here. And I want us to realize, if you remember nothing else from this today, when you think of the woman at the well, when John 4 comes up, any point in your future, I hope you remember the actions Jesus took, not just for her, but for us, to belong. And that we need to take that belonging and share it with one another. Let's not let his death be in vain, but realize the great family that we belong to.